Nobody that I know of in my field uses the so-called scientific method. In our field, it's by the seat of your pants. It's leaps of logic. It's guesswork.
You don't see the curvature of the earth. That stuff is flat.
GLOBEBUSTERS taking over. Bye-bye, moonlight and rover. NASA so mediocre. Sorry, but your ball is dead. But your ball is. GLOBEBUSTERs taking over. Gotta ride this roller coaster. But the truth is getting closer. Sorry, but your ball is dead. But your ball is. Get the shovel for the space hubble. Piecing up the puzzle. Need to burst your bubble. Evil gonna crumble, yeah? Sit down, be humble. Got the ball, you better fumble. You'll get mad, cause at this fight I'm Bob's your uncle.
And then they call me the liar. I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable the pathetic techniques that they have to use to prove their heliocentric model.
Bob's at the president, Jeran got the evidence. Airy slaying Jesuits and Zack is evident. That the earth electric and it's resonant. Your residence is heaven sent. I hope to settle in like some sediment. If we so wrong, why they lying to discredit it? That's not too intelligent. That's a guy, not an in court, but we ain't really in the settlement. It's time to awaken from the pseudoscience sedatives.
GLOBEBUSTERs taking over. Bye-bye, moonlight and rover. NASA so mediocre. Sorry, but your ball is dead. But your ball is. GLOBEBUSTERs taking over. Gotta ride this roller coaster. But the truth is getting closer. Sorry, but your ball is dead. But your ball is.
Inner World Productions.
And welcome to GLOBEBUSTERS. It is my fault that we are late. So, Lo Siento, we are on YouTube, Rockfin, Rumble, X. And this is the second episode of season 12 called The Missing Element. Should be a good one. I'm sure most of you know what that's in reference to, but let's introduce the panel. Let's start with my boy Zack from Good Times for All. How's it going, brother?
Man, Austin, it's been a crazy year, and we're not even through it. But you know, there are a lot of people, and even I think you even said this, that this was going to be a year where a lot of truths were going to come out, and they are. There's a lot of truths that are coming out right now, like things that have been spoken about, you know, in quiet corners and this and that for years, decades even. But we're seeing things in Hollywood and the music industry like we've never seen before. This is unprecedented times since I've been alive. And I just think the truth coming out all over the place in so many different fields is just awesome. So I'm doing great.
Nice. Yeah, man. It's an interesting time to be alive, to say the least. All right. We also have my boy Airy. How's it going, brother?
Hello, Witsit. Hello, everyone. Well, I am not going to be so deep like Zack, but I'm doing well. And I'm going to share the same idea that there is a lot of truth coming out, and we're part of it. So it's nice to be alive.
Yeah, man. Agreed. All right. And we also have my boy always coming in the clutch last minutes, Alan from Space Eyes. What's up, brother?
Yo, what's good, man? Glad to be here. Heard we're going to talk about some ether today and/or the removal of said ether. Can't wait to about that.
Yeah, man. And for those who peeped it, I threw your boy Albert down at the bottom of the thumbnail, getting hit by the laser. So good times. All right. So because it is the 22nd and we have Flatoberfest coming up, I figured that we would. This is the final GLOBEBUSTERS before said Flatoberfest, so I figured we would play a video. We'll play the little minute trailer for Flatoberfest. You can get your tickets at flatearthfestivals.com. And I think you can use pretty much any pretty decently prominent Flat Earth creator as a discount, and which means you're only allowed in if you use witsitgetsit as the code. All right, let's play the stream. Let's play the video real quick. Very cool. All right. And I don't know if there's another video or anyone that Karen, maybe you want me to play or whatever. You can send it to me. We'll play it before the stream's over. But yeah, that is this weekend, starting Friday through Sunday, 27th through the 29th. Like I said, you get your tickets at flyersfestivals.com, and you saw some of the names there. And I will be speaking as well, so should be cool, man. It's going to be outside, tons of room. I'm pretty excited. I think it's a cool vibe. All right, cool. And then Zach, you will be there per usual with Cami.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, and I heard of a new addition just recently. I think I can say it right here. She says Mario Garza of Symbolic Studies will also be there, but can I say it?
Well, just wait for confirmation if you're that
Okay,
nervous, man.
yeah.
All right, Kieran, confirm or deny that he can reveal this precious information.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's 100%. I know there's a talk and it's rumbling, and I'm pretty sure he's going to be there.
Ben Shapiro.
No, definitely not Ben Shapiro.
Jordan Peterson.
No, he was busy. He said
Charlie Kirk. You got to get a Zionist, man. It's the only way. Well, cool. We won't veer off into that, but obviously, Zach was saying before the show, he's like, dude, it was such a crazy time. And it really is, because you just get on X and you watch like modern weaponry used in 1080, and we're just desensitized to watching like literal missiles get intercepted and exploded over cities that people live in, and entire bombs just destroying play. Like, you can just go to X and basically watch a live feed of a war. And it's pretty crazy. It's pretty crazy. And it's ramping up. We don't know what to believe, not to believe, what's wartime propaganda, who's telling the truth about what videos are accurate. We just sit back and we're like, oh man, this is cool.
Yeah, it's insane.
Yeah, I think you got permission. Yeah.
Yeah, Freeman Fly is going to be coming again. He's been to a couple of them. His presentations are amazing.
Nice. All right, cool. MC Tune, someone said.
No.
So, yeah, today's stream is Missing Element. Now, I know that we did pop up Alan last minute. We also got my boy Airy. I don't know if you guys have anything specific you want to talk about. Feel free to ever jump in, or if you want to present something, we can do that. But I do think that this is a major thing. Most people that follow my work know that I'm like obsessed with it. I know, obviously, Alan's part of Ether Cosmology. You got Shane, you got Toby over there. This is one of the biggest components of the lie. It's joined at the hip with geocentrism, a special location, or position. It was removed. And nowadays, if you say something about the ether, either A, people just laugh and say you're stupid, that was just proved a long time ago, and they don't know anything about it. Or B, they're using the word ether now, but not to mean ether. They're saying stuff like relativistic ether and space-time ether, or there's this like whistleblower dude or whatever. He talks about Ashton Forbes talks about, technology the government has. He talks about the ether is true, Tesla was right, and then he says space-time, black holes and warp drive, and it's just crazy. So basically, we're seeing a damage control kind of propaganda narrative to absorb the ether. And so I thought it would be cool to discuss it. I think it's been a while, and I don't like to see it get forgotten, So, one thing I thought we would do is play my boy Einstein talking about the ether. It's just a minute long. It's 44 seconds long. It's a clip. You're obviously not going to actually watch a video of him speaking in English, because he basically never did that coherently. So it's supposedly him talking with videos that aren't actually of him talking. But I think it's important to lay this out here so that, and I know Alan will have a comment. Anyone on the panel has a comment, let me know. And I think this is a good way to get us started.
Cool.
So let's play this psychopathic grabbler here. All right.
Although skeptics often point to Einstein's theory of relativity, it was Einstein who in 1920 said,
There are weighty arguments to be adduced in favor of the ether hypothesis. To deny the ether is ultimately to assume that empty space has no physical qualities whatsoever. The fundamental facts of mechanics do not harmonize with this view. According to the general theory of relativity, space is endowed with physical qualities. In this sense, therefore, there exists an ether. According to the general theory of relativity, space without ether is unthinkable.
Wow, why have I never heard that before?
However,
Oh, yeah. Yep. And he has many such quotes. He said at one point, I was, years after relativity was proposed, he said, I was incorrect when I asserted the non-existence of an ether. I would have been more accurate to assert the non-existence of an ether drift, because space without ether is unthinkable. He specifically says in his paper basically that space must be endowed with physical properties because without such we have nothing to measure against, meaning time or space. So dimensions, measuring rods and clocks is what he said specifically. And so it must have physical properties, thus it must be ether. So basically what he did out of the arrogance and narcissism that he possessed, thought that he could redefine and enlighten us as to what ether means. And he says, when we say ether, we mean nothing more than space must be endowed with physical properties. That is not what ether means. Ether does not mean nothing more than your conceptual reification fallacy. That's not what ether is. And so the reason this is pretty important is because you should ask yourself, why did he have to do the 180? Why did he have to end up saying, I was wrong, there has to be an ether? And he has another quote really quickly where he says, the idea of the ether has progressed throughout all of recorded history of man, but it is no longer considered, again, this is this narcissistic approach, which is like whatever he said is whatever it is, but ether is no longer considered a medium comprised of particles, but it is often misunderstood, I'm paraphrasing, that relativity has ended ether. Ether's story is by no means finished, but rather continued by relativity. So, yeah.
Got a quick thought on that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so when he introduced general relativity, or this was expanding the theory of covariance, all frames, right? So no longer just rectilinear constant velocity. Here he's saying, introducing rotation and acceleration for general theory, and that's facilitated by bending and warping of space-time, which is curvatures. He introduces a new term, which is curvilinear. Right. Well, if you're a photon and you're traveling on a curved linear path, accelerating, and if you're accelerating, you're exceeding the speed of light. So it's inherently implied that he's adding like c plus or minus v to his theory, which can't be not allowed, right? So there's a contradiction there, just in the terms of something falling along a curve. And then on top of that, there was the geocentric frame, right? So when you take the Earth and you put it in a geocentric frame, universe has to spin around, to facilitate that frame. And with the dimensions that they give for everything, the ends of the universe would be moving faster than, faster than the speed of light. So that's another contradiction. He was like trying to throw a bone out there to be like, hey, maybe I overlooked something, boys. But then you notice no one in the mainstream picked up or like went on to carry that, because they had already removed themselves from the idea of a fluid medium that would permeate all of space, that all motion would be relative to. Because if you bring that back, people are going to ask where their velocity measurement is of Earth traveling around the sun, and they can't have that. So,
yeah, and so I've realized that a lot of people don't understand the simplicity in the concept here. So it's very simple. Long before Einstein, people had done tests, and they found out you can determine exactly when light will be received at a certain location. You'll know how fast the light is, how long it takes to get the light, right? Based on the medium it's quote unquote traveling through and how fast that medium's moving. So in really simple terms, if you take how fast the stream of water moves and you add it to the speed the swimmer swims at, you will be able to accurately predict when they'll get there. You'll know how fast it is in total. C plus V. C, of course, being the proposed constancy of light and the velocity of the medium. So they had already proven that this was accurate. That if you account for the medium and the motion within that medium, it's going to directly affect what people call the speed of light. It had been so proven at that point that it was just was integrated into any future understanding of physics. It's just a fact. That's the actual background of things like Airy's failure and then Michelson-Morley and then Michelson-Gale-Pearson. It was just all of classical wave mechanics, all of electrical field theory, all understanding of modern physics at the time was built upon this development that the speed that the medium moves is directly related to the total speed of quote unquote light. So again, the simplest analogy of it is if I swim across a moving stream, I'm going to go slower than if I swim with one. And everyone in here understands that intuitively. Yeah, duh, of course. If I swim against the current, I'm going to go slower than if I swim with the current. In fact, if I can swim 10 miles per hour, but the current's going 5 miles per hour, I'm going to go 15 miles per hour. It's that simple. Okay. And so when you understand that there's a background medium as well, if there's movement within it, light's going to also be affected by that. They had to do away with this simple, intuitive, undeniable understanding to keep the heliocentric model.
Yeah, they had to take away the water from the swimmer.
They had to do mental gymnastics to explain why C wasn't C. Why it was as if there was a medium that was moving, like you said, as if there were water moving, the light was acting as if there was some type of medium moving. But they couldn't have that, right? Because it didn't show the values they claimed it to, or predicted that it would if the Earth was moving. So I think everyone can get that simple of a concept, and that's what this really all boils down to. So the irony of someone having the audacity to mock those who are ether proponents is actually pretty rich, because you're actually combating a simplistically undeniable truth on its face. Now, obviously, we can get into all of the specifics, right, of subsequent tests and how it worked and stuff like that. But that's how this went down. And that should kind of help you understand the context of Airy's failure, which was where they took a telescope, they filled it with water. Water was a known variable, it was a known medium that we could reliably, use reliably, right, to know what was going to happen, because we knew how light reacted within the water, how it affected its propagation, had been proven. So I don't know if, Alan, you want to touch on that at all, or I know you might get played out on talking about things like Airy's failure, but do you want to kind of give your take on the progress of that, basically the sequence of events where people then get to observations such as Airy's failure?
Yeah, absolutely. So starting with the early 1800s, they started doing experiments with light where they would shoot a beam through a medium, and then based on the diffraction pattern, they established the properties. So this is how they came up with the refractive index. This is how they came up with the electric and magnetic permeability, because those factors are directly affecting the propagation or the induction rate, essentially, that's going on inside of that medium. That's how they established, all these indexes for everything, right? So by the time they had all that information, there was a hypothesis that that moving water would move the ether. But let's back up on the ether real quick. So their conceptualization of the ether back in the day was that it was a static, rigid ether, right? So it doesn't move, it doesn't do anything. You move through it. Now, this is in part from how they internalized the Copernican principle that the Earth holds no special place and it's moving through some empty space or whatever, right? They knew there was an ether because that's how the laws of electromagnetism were derived with lines of force and all that. So they were all on board with the medium, right? But their conceptualization of the dynamics of it was that it was a static ether and that you would be moving through it. Now, when they started doing experiments like Airy's failure and Fresnel drag, started off of going back to James Bradley and his telescope, up directly 90 degrees at his zenith, he sees a star that's not directly at the 90 degrees, and he has to tilt his telescope a little bit. They were hypothesizing that the reason they had to tilt it was because of Earth's velocity over the course of a year, because plot out the maximum dimensions, that deviation that he has to correct for, it comes out to about 20 arc seconds. So when you ratio that over the speed of light, it actually comes out to 30 kilometers a second. So everyone was like, "Oh, no way, dude. We found Earth's orbital velocity. We found it." Now that's kinematics. It's a measurement. It can't tell you if the Earth is moving or if the sky is moving. So that's where Airy came in and was like, "Well, what do we know about?" Actually, before Airy, there was Fresnel. So let's do Fresnel first because it's why they carried on with it. So they knew that they could measure the translational motion of moving water in an interferometer. So basically, they take a light beam, they split it, it goes in opposite directions, and then recombines. And halfway through its travel time, it hits moving water. It's moving at the same speed. So it's going with and against this flow of water, and they know the refractive index from all the other work they did. So they had a predicted amount by how much the water from the refractive index would slow light, and then how much the velocity would. And they measured it directly proportional to 88% of the velocity of the water, 44% of a speed boost as you're going with the water. Like you were saying, when you're swimming with the stream, you go faster, and then it was reduced by a 44% going against the water because going against the current. So now you're losing velocity. Those effects were independent of the refractive index. Right? This velocity translation measured. Their hypothesis was that there was a stationary ether, but it was a material medium, just really tiny and viscous or whatever. But it would be dragged by another material media, which would be water. That's where they got their velocity addition conceptualization of how it would work, and then they measured that. So they were like, "Oh, no way, we could measure this." So then, when Airy put water in the telescope, verify James Bradley's observations, there where I was talking about the stellar aberration, where looking up and he had to tilt his telescope a little bit. So what Airy's did is he had two telescopes. He filled one with water and one not with water, and it was to see how much that correction angle would have to be course of a year. And what he found that he only had to tilt his telescope by zero point 0.8 arc seconds. That's a fraction of a fraction of a fraction what they had expected. They had expected a total of 30 arc seconds throughout the course of the year, 15 first part of the year, and 15 backwards the other part because you're going towards the sun and then away from it. So you're going to have different perception of the delay there. And like I said, what they found was that they only had to tilt it by zero point 0.8 arc seconds, which indicates that the starlight already comes in at that angle and that the Earth is stationary. And they never really touch on the implications of that. They just go, "Oh, well, it looks like that hypothesis was untenable." But they knew that light would carry, or if that water in that telescope carried a 30-kilometer second velocity potential, that would have to be corrected for, and it didn't. That's a huge refutation to Earth being the causal mechanism of why the starlight comes in at an angle. It's game over right there. But because they're involving a medium and all that, we're going to reduce the amount of velocity that they could measure due to the refractive index. They were like, "Okay, well, let's try it with an open air," and that's where Michelson-Morley in 1881 came through. Now that device is argued that was too sensitive to make the measurement and whatnot. So they were like, "Okay, we'll redo it," and they redid it in 1887 with a more stable apparatus, dipped in a floating in a mercury vat to eliminate, different ambient vibrations from the environment and whatnot. So when they took that measurement, they did 6 days of measurements, and they measured a velocity that was 6 to 8 kilometers a second, and their device was sensitive enough to measure 2 kilometers a second and be accurate. They took the 6 to 8 and they said, "You know what? This is just experimental error, and there's no we can't turns out we can't measure it for some reason." And part of that was because the predicted amount was 30 kilometers a second because based off of Kepler's laws and Newtonian dynamics in Kepler's laws through a little algebraic shuffling, they have they were claiming like causal mechanisms of why the bodies move in the sky and all that. So there was a lot at stake here because this was supposed to be the substantiation of Newtonian dynamics applied to the sky and apply like a physical meaning as to why these bodies are moving. If the Earth doesn't have a 30 kilometer a second velocity, that everything they've put forward is just made up. So, Cavendish, all of that to backwards derive everything and insert it into Kepler's law, was all at stake here. So when they didn't get that measurement, they were pretty perplexed by it because it's very definitive. These interferometer measurements, absolute measurements of velocity, they're the most precise measurement of velocity possible. As long as your wavelength, as long as your motion exceeds the wavelength, then you can measure, and you can get real tiny with those wavelengths. So they definitely had the ability to do it, and the solution that they came up with was first proposed by Henrik Lorentz and what's the other guy? Poincare. I'm sorry, Fitzgerald. Um, Lorentz and Fitzgerald came up with a contraction mechanism, their ether theory. This was again a static ether theory. They said that a rigid body would compress at a proportional ratio, or not proportional, would compress as a function of the square of its velocity, p squared, which is essentially link contraction and time dilation that we're all familiar with in relativistic sense. Now, the static ether model that they were presenting provides the exact same mechanisms. Then Einstein came along in 1905. Actually, there was a couple lads before him that derived the same thing. But anyway, he comes along and he goes, "Boys, we don't need any ether. We can explain this as light propagating through a vacuum as quantized energy chunks," which comes a little later. But what he's proposing in moving the ether mechanism for the compression, saying if we look at time in these coordinates as defined by two time variables that are not connected by absolute time, that all time is relative because it's just defined as a function of velocity. Everything's in motion and it all has to be relative to something. So the redefining of it allowed them to make changes to the time coordinate and the distance coordinate. That would be function of the square of the velocity over p squared. And then when they applied that vacuous mechanism, right, with no medium, and they just said that it's actually time and space itself that changes. They really had like unlimited leadway with that was a lot. So, if anyone has any questions,
No, dude. Yeah, if you have questions, look, I'm gonna actually on the YouTube, I'm gonna create a question section. So if you have, okay, please ask questions specific to the topic. But if you have any questions, you can go to the YouTube. You can enter your questions there, and it'll be in a separate section for us to read.
So do they claim now that this, this test isn't valid? Like that the whole concept of it is false? Or how
yeah.
do they get around even?
So they make very brief mention of Airy's failure in physics textbooks. One big one that's called the Bible of Physics. I have to look up the name off the top of my head. The big one that they use for classical mechanics to teach everyone basics and whatnot. And they just go, well, when you apply relativistic velocity composition law, which is just like, velocity addition and relativity, like it predicts that there won't be any movement, so we're good to go. But like they can't even acknowledge the fact that there was a 0.8 arc second deviation, right? They have to round everything to zero to make it so that you can't have an actual measurement of it because in your frame, you're experiencing contraction and dilation, can't tell. So
That makes perfect sense. Even like when Bradley was getting his numbers. I mean, they still record this today while they're measuring stellar aberration. But if it's a negative, like they always get, it's not like it happens once in a century or something. Certain stars are always aberrating in the wrong direction. And they just mark it as a zero.
Yeah, the parallax angles, they'll like it'll exceed positive measurement and they'll turn around and say that it's positive. They'll just swoop it up or they'll round it to a zero like you were. Or what they'll do is they'll use that negative distance reference for another star, and they'll use that to like validate the positive parallax of another star. So when they put out these data set tables that are all have different negative parallaxes in them, they tell you like specific parameters, like, hey, don't you go and try and correct these because it'll mess up the other distances that we've based off of these negative parallaxes. But we swear that they're all positive and the negatives are just experimental measurement stuff. So, don't worry about it, and we'll use them as references as we slowly zero them out to make them all positive. It's psychotic.
It is.
Yo, and I don't want to go too far off here, but just so you people know why this is so important, and I say you people, there's some haters, obviously. We are on X as well, x.com/GLOBEBUSTERS, but this was known as a fundamental axiom to interpret the world through for thousands of years. Okay, so set aside, like, is everything we were told about Greek philosophers true or whatever, right? Aristotle considered this pivotal, and this is very simple as to why. I can ask a few simple questions here. What exists outside of the material world? Something or nothing? Well, nothing cannot exist, so what are you left with? Okay,
Something.
so it took me 7 seconds to logically refute opposition to an ether. When you don't have that fundamental understanding of logical consistency as a framework, you can't comprehend anything. This is why people are completely detached from even attempting to understand the world, and they think experts must do it for them, right? And I could certainly see where you hear some of us discuss some of the specifics. You might have heard Alan kind of break that down, and some of it may be foreign to you. There's no way you didn't follow the waters moving analogy, right? But my point is that this was known for a long time. It was considered the fifth element. It was called the quintessential element, that everything comes from that, a primary substrate, a requirement to the material world. There being a requirement of something outside of it, well, then the material world seemingly came from it, interacts with it. It's a substrate for it. It isn't bound to the material dimensional ideas that we view the world through. I don't think people understand the implications of removing that. I don't think people understand the history of it. So yeah, it's very interesting. When you listen to what Alan's breaking down right now, you got to wonder, like, what is it that you're so devoted to philosophically that you will shatter the entire history of physics, electrical field theory, and logical understanding to hold on to it? And the answer actually is the heliocentric model. That is literally the answer, because the data didn't match that assumption.
Yeah, that and the Copernican principle, the idea that the Earth holds no special place. So in order to do that, you got to make the Earth move. Otherwise, you're going to be the center of everything around you. And
Actually, that's what it actually is. Yeah, that's the actual philosophy for sure.
Yep, and you guys gotta realize that our entire history, all these experiments, everything is handed down to us a lens of people at the Royal Society. So, these are all people that had the same philosophy. That's why when you read these experiments, conclusions to them, none of them outright say, this implies the Earth is stationary. Like, they'll leave it ambiguous or open ended, some other interpretation as to like why it can't possibly be measured. That's really the crux of it, right?
Yeah, and like a perfect time to make this quote. And this is, if you're not familiar with this, you can go to my YouTube, witsitgetsit, geocentrism. Obviously, you can't just YouTube that because it will not pop up. But you can go down my live streams and find the geocentrism one. Or you can go to yandex.com actually and probably search it, witsitgetsit, and then geocentrism. But this is George F.R. Ellis. He said, I can construct for you a spherically symmetrical universe with Earth at its center, and you cannot disprove it based on observations. You can only exclude it on philosophical grounds, specifically the philosophy that was just alluded to by Alan, which is the Copernican principle that the Earth does not occupy a special or unique position. In my view, there's absolutely nothing wrong in that. Well, I have a staunch disagreement with that opinion, but whatever. What I bring, and I guess not technically, because like I said to Jeran last week, like if people want to just openly state that they view all the evidence through a biased lens of philosophy, and then they don't falsely claim it to be science and then mock and ridicule and berate anyone that dare speak out against their unquestionable religious belief, then that's fine. Like, acknowledge that this is a philosophy. You have a philosophical bias. Stop claiming it's science and that it's been proven. You're lying. What I want to bring into the open is the fact that we are using philosophical criteria in choosing our models. A lot of cosmology tries to hide that, right? And that is crucially important. So, and I know some of you guys have probably heard a lot of this stuff before. And on the screen right now, we're showing some stuff about Michelson-Morley. And I don't know, Alan, before I switch off the screen, do you want to comment on this part of the video right here? I don't know if you saw it, but
Yeah, so that's Fizeau testing Fresnel drag. That was the hypothesis that it was a stationary physical medium, that it would be dragged by another material medium. And that hypothesis was substantiated because they measured that 88% velocity, 88% of the velocity of the water. And that's why the follow-up experiment of Zack in 1913 was the first time that the fringe patterns exceeded the refractive index, right? Because in the water, the fringe pattern would be really small because it's already reduced by 70% water. I can't remember. Goes down substantially. So the velocity component that's translated to that, those fringes are even smaller. Now, when they did it in open air, they're just straight up measuring the velocity directly proportional 1-to-1. Now, in relativity theory, they do square the velocity over c squared, much, much smaller. And then also you can't measure in any frame, so you would actually predict no fringes. Now, when Sagnac took that interferometer and spun it around in open air, I mean, it's game over right there. That's an absolute measurement of velocity. So it makes the hypothesis that, oh, well, the Michelson interferometer couldn't do it because of, ether compression, or, it's now untenable. This is why it's so important.
yeah, absolutely, man. And what we can do, unless somebody wants to say something else, is there's this video here. It's called "What Is Ether," and it's 6 minutes long. And I think it would be edifying for everyone to listen to some of it and then to pause and commentate and correct the misinformation, right? Because I want people to understand, like, this. It's so frustrating to me because I feel like I've talked so extensively about this that we get kind of disillusioned and we don't realize that most of the world is still being so deceived by this. And people hear this and they're like, this is so nerdy. What's it matter? It matters a ton, dude. Like it literally created your worldview. Like it is directly relevant to how you view the entire world. It is the only reason people believe that atheism and nihilism are tenable, like logically, literally. And that may seem heavy, but that's the case. So if you guys are down, unless you want to say, anyone wants to say anything before we play, it's just 6 minutes, but there'll be a couple moments that we definitely need to pause and correct. But I think it gives kind of a decent overview of the history of it.
Yeah, absolutely. As we continue, I'm going to put a link to my community page chat, and I'll have a link to Witsit's video, presentation that you did a couple of 2 years ago, I think it is now, on the ether, and it's time stamped and marked, so you guys can check all of the timestamps to skip to where he did the re-recording of it because there were audio issues at the beginning. But if you want to learn about the history of the philosophical framework of interpretation of the ether versus atomism and all that, you did a fantastic breakdown 2 years ago, and it's highly relevant and still just as good as it was when you released it. And that's very important because it covers that the history of it and why it suddenly had to be removed because there was a conflict with another philosophy that they had, and we see which one they went with because it gives explanatory power, albeit fake explanatory power, but it gives them explanatory power over the heavens. I mean, imagine you tell someone why something's moving in the sky, like these celestial bodies, right? You're like, oh, I know why it moves. I know how much it weighs. Like, you would lose all of that power if you don't have physics to back up the velocities and stuff that you're putting forward. If you can't measure it in your frame, how are you going to tell me what it is on some other place? So this is why so important and to know the history of it.
Yeah, a couple. Appreciate the shout out too. That's the number one most requested redo streams I have. So I need to redo it. So a question for Alan here: do I need to know math in order to understand and read these papers?
Nope. It certainly helps though, but no.
And the reason that it helps to understand the math is because you understand what the math represents and the variables within the equations and what they mean.
Yep.
For example, Michelson-Morley, when people tell you it has nothing to do with the motion of the Earth, just a rudimentary understanding of the math involved is extremely lethal to that type of claim, because it's like, well, for one, so is the title, on the relative motion of Earth and the ether. But when you get into it, it's like, well, what equation did they use to come up with their prediction, right? Because if they clarified it as a null result or classified it as a null result, then that means that they didn't achieve the result expected. It was null result, right? And they actually rounded down to that allegedly null result. But so it wasn't null. But the point is, the equation has two velocity components. One of them is representing the velocity of light. And if you actually read Edward Morley, because it's Albert Michelson or Michelson and then Edward Morley, that's why you get Michelson-Morley, Michelson-Morley. I believe the proper interpretation of his name, as he would say, is Michelson. Anyway, when you look at the reason that he, like Edward Morley wrote a letter to his father explaining why he was doing the test. He was so excited about it. And he wrote, we're setting up a test to finally determine the velocity of light. Is it constant? Does it change based on direction and motion? That was the actual purpose of the test. And so they used the two assumed variables, the ether and the motion of the Earth. So on the relative motion of Earth and the ether. So when you go look at the equation they used, it has the velocity of light, right, and the velocity of the Earth in the equation. So in that scenario, if you understand, like on a basic level, what that equation means and what it represents, it's crucial to understanding and even combating the misinformation about it.
Yep.
So
and to this, and just like they had that equation spot on because it's the same derivation that Sagnac used for the Sagnac effect. It's the same one that's used in ring laser gyros to this day. Like they figured it out in the 1800s. Like it's not like they had the scale wrong or something like that. They knew exactly what they were measuring and what they expected. Reason they had a fringe shift pattern predicted off of 30 kilometers a second because of Kepler's laws and Newtonian dynamics apply.
That's exactly.
Which would have to put the Earth moving at 30 kilometers a second, which is the old, what is it, 66,000.666 or whatever miles per hour. So that's where all that comes from and why it has to be.
Yeah, and I'll just say, words of encouragement here, and I say this humbly as possible. Like, we are the only ones truly making conceptual progress. And so when I say we, the people that are not bound to scientism. And so people may have a lot to say, certainly on the, I'm sure, as GLOBEBUSTERS Twitter or X account grows, but the truth is that we're filling a void that is incredibly important, where we've then discovered the logical implications, and it's because we just start looking through it, where now we understand, oh, wait, this was a direct refutation of Newtonian mechanics and Newtonian gravity in terms of the assumed orbit of the Earth. And we figured that out, right? That's we figured it out. And Alan and Shane and Toby and Fizeau have figured out major things that are overlooked. And the reason is not that we are intellectually superior to everyone. It is that they're not even looking because they can't. That's it, right? And so when we're like, oh, well, if a law of motion of Newton's law of motion says an object will continue in a straight path unless an outside force is acting upon it. And then, of course, that Newtonian gravity, that doesn't have a time variable in the equation, meaning it has to be instant. There isn't time accounted for in the equation for Newtonian gravity. So he's saying there's a force and that he can't explain it, that there must be an ether, it must be a direct act of God. Don't ask me what it is. Don't ask me what the medium is. Just, whatever. I reverse engineered Kepler's laws that are kinematic, claimed there was a dynamic equivalence, and then we just moved on, whatever. He saw an apple and suddenly he's like, you know what? Giant balls move around each other with magical forces. That's the official story, I guess, that an apple fell and this guy had an epiphany that he must reify concepts. But my point is, when you understand that on a very simple level, Newton said gravity was a force that was intrinsic in matter. Meaning wherever there is matter, there is gravity. It is an intrinsic property of matter. So the idea is, well, an object will continue in a straight path unless an outside force acts upon it. So they say the Earth is moving, right? And he actually wasn't even fully a heliocentrist. That's totally a misnomer. He would never proclaimed one way or the other definitively. And actually, the last page of his Principia says the Earth could be in the center for sure. That was conveniently removed prior to final publication until it was dug up by a university professor many years later. But the point being that if you believe the Earth is moving, right, and you're going to apply Newton's laws of motion, well, then the Earth's just going to keep moving straight forever until what? Until a force acts on it to pull it out of that straight path. An object will continue in a straight path till an outside force acts upon it. Well, they say the Earth doesn't move in a straight path, right? They say it moves around the sun. That's where we get a year from. For those of you at home that were curious, supposedly the Earth takes 365 days roughly to move around the sun. That's where we get a year. Supposedly it's moving 30 kilometers a second or 66,600 miles per hour. And of course, it's tilted, wobbling on a 23.4 degree elliptical orbit. So, and when I say of course it is claimed. So,
or 66.6 degrees from top down. Right?
That's right, 23.4 taken from 90. So not to overwhelm people, because I know I can start to go fast, but in a very simple idea here, that means that the sun must have this huge mass, tons of gravity, and it's pulling the Earth out of its straight path. Because otherwise, if that force wasn't acting on the Earth to pull it out, it would continue straight. This was the accepted idea all the way up until Michelson-Morley, right? Because gravity was then replaced. First, you have 1905 special relativity, where Einstein basically tries to exclude geocentrism in this roundabout implied way. Then you get to 1915, he basically has to just do a 180 flip on himself. He flip-flops and is like, oh, it turns out it's completely viable. He couldn't come up with any way possible. He found out the implications of special relativity required him acknowledge geocentrism was valid. My point is 1915, general relativity. That's where everyone that's what you've heard of relativity, the theory of relativity, right? The theory of relativity is even a misnomer. There are two theories of relativity, but it's the concept of general relativity being gravity. Why did Michelson-Morley end up resulting in the change in gravity? That's because if there was an outside force acting on the Earth to remove it from a straight path, the interferometer would have had to detect its motion, because we know interferometers detect angular motion. Like if an object moves at an angle, changes direction, you can detect it with an interferometer. These are now lasers. Back then, just light beams. They use cross interference patterns. So when you start to really sparse through it, you realize this has major implications everywhere that no one knows about. You know, Michelson-Morley and the devotion to Copernican principle forced them to reluctantly get rid of Newtonian gravity and Newtonian mechanics within the heliocentric framework. And we know that we can use Newtonian mechanics and Newton's laws of motion so well on the Earth until you get to the quote-unquote quantum scale, that they can't let go of it. We use it for engineering. Like Newton's laws of motion offer extreme predictability on the local scale in terms of engineering and motion and stuff like this. So they will tell you to repeat things such as they're both true, they're not mutually exclusive, blah, blah, blah. But it's not true. And I won't rant much longer, but my point is, the point I'm elucidating here is that without the people that aren't scared of societal ostracism or have to fit into the norm and have to obey the dogma of scientism, you would never discover these things. And we're just going to continue to devolve or remain stagnant while our government does the opposite, because they know the stuff that we're saying. Right. So yeah, and to name them real quick, the blatant contradictions, the most glaring contradictions between the two. An object will continue in a straight path unless an outside force acts upon it. Einstein said, nope, an object can go in a straight path and a curved path at the same time from different reference frames, and no force is required. And then, of course, Newton said that there had to be an ether, material or immaterial medium, but an actual substantive medium or with substantive qualities. So there has to be an ether. Einstein said there is no ether. Then we saw he flip-flops and changed the definition of ether. And then, of course, Newton said space is absolute and fixed, where Einstein said it's not, and specifically said it can't be. And then Newton said gravity is a force, whereas Einstein came in and said gravity is not a force. So these can't be. The point is that this changed the entire model. This changed all of physics. And if you go read Wikipedia, it's going to tell you, oh, it just disproved the ether. And both Newton and Einstein are right. So that's my encouragement. A long-winded way I could have if I could redo it, I'd said it shorter and more concisely. But think for yourself, because It's needed. It's needed. People that are intelligent and diligent and want to know the truth and can think conceptually and have spatial reasoning, sparsing through this information and the propaganda to get to the truth is there's such a shortage of that the time and energy you put into that is going to be extremely impactful because most people are afraid to do it. So, all right, sorry, I know that was kind of meta.
No, well said, man.
Oh, thanks. So you guys are down to watch this video real quick, and then we'll just commentate anytime anyone wants to say anything, just say something. I'll pause it.
Cool.
All right, cool. So this is kind of a bit of a history about the ether. So let's check it out.
What is ether? And I should actually more specifically call it what is the ether. And if we go back to early times, early Greek times, the word comes from Greek mythology, where it was the essence, the air that the gods were breathing. Anyway, Plato and Aristotle used it as they defined the elements, at that time 4 elements. Medieval philosophers continued to use this idea of the ether as a 5th element, and they associated it with the motion of planets, moving around space, and space includes an ether with a known density. By 1687, Sir Isaac Newton published his famous works on gravity, and he used the ether as the medium for explaining how gravity worked. Now, Newton also did a lot of work on light, which has known wave properties, and he used the ether, again, as the medium for moving waves.
Okay, breeze right through that. But I'll say something real quick, and anyone else wants to input here. But for those who don't know, of course, Newton ostensibly was a genius. I say ostensibly if we assume what we're told about him is true, right? By 22, this man had developed what's referred to as gravity and calculus. But assuming what we've been told about him is true, he was predominantly a metaphysical author. But
he was an alchemist.
He was indeed, yes. And seemingly was really into the occultic sun worshipping path. But what he said specifically was that to think that gravity can act on innate brute matter through vast distances in a vacuum without some type of medium is, to me, so great an absurdity that no man with competent faculty of thinking in philosophical matters could ever fall into it. And whether or not this medium is material or immaterial, I have left to the consideration of my readers. And I think I got that just about verbatim. And what that's saying is, according to Newton, what is currently claimed to be true is retarded. So the irony of people pretending that they're on his side, right? And
not to attribute it to him.
Yeah. Specifically, like any specific claims about it, yeah. And what's so interesting about this, the easiest way to understand this is, like I said, gravity doesn't have a time variable. So what is Einstein's claim to fame, right? Which it's stolen and plagiarized from Henri Poincaré, but it's 4D space geometry, and it's space and time, right? Time dilates, it gets wider, it slows down, time. There was no time variable in Newton's gravity. And so what that means is if you look at Newton's equations and take it to be true, gravity's instantaneous. And so also you couldn't have instantaneous action at a distance, what was later coined spooky action at a distance, I believe, by Einstein, without a medium touching both of the objects at the same time. You need mutual contact at the least to have something be instant, right? Similar to a string attached to 2 distant bowling balls or something. Like with nothing actually in contact with both the bowling balls. You couldn't claim that anything was affecting them both instantaneously. So what do? They do mental gymnastics to basically claim that time itself can change, and then you can get things that appear to be constant. Be instant. So anyway, but yes, what they don't tell you is that on the final page of his Principia, he said, like in the Ptolemaic model, which is a geocentric model, it could absolutely be true if there was a force akin to gravity with an equal and opposite reaction. They removed that page. I want you to really soak this in, bro. They removed the final page of his Principia before they published it. It wasn't even known about until recently when a university found it and brought attention to it. Why would they do that? Who's they? Who cares? Whoever published it? Why? Why would you have to do that? And that should make you think. So he says, in order for gravity to be true, and he does say, like, don't really attribute these ideas to me per se, or that I'm making the specific claims. He says he can't comprehend them at all. It must be a direct act of God if gravity is actually true. It must be God doing it live. But that there has to be a medium in order for it to even be possible theoretically. And to not acknowledge that is stupid. You have to be logically bankrupt. He then goes on to write extensively about the ether, right? Analogizing it to liquid silver, but with no viscosity. And he writes in depth about the ether. And so another rich irony is that Newton was a very strong proponent of an ether required it, or assumed it a requirement.
And that's amazing that he wrote that, because that's, like when we take the helium and put it into super low pressures, it kind of looks like that silver liquid almost that does its own thing. So
basically what he proposed was like an idea of superfluid, that's basically
fluid.
Yeah. For those who don't know, superfluid has no viscosity, right? Which is like resistance to motion. So, yeah, cool. Anyone, any input on that, like rant about Newton? Or Alan, do you want to quickly kind of explain the misconception of Newtonian gravity and it being like this standalone, ingenious, dynamic epiphany?
Yeah, so big G and all of that, derived from Cavendish, comes from what it boils down to, right? When you're accounting for the weight of the balls, right? This is all a ratio, little g, right? We've only ever measured downward acceleration. But when you drop something at a rate, you kinematically derive how fast that it hit the ground. And we're like, oh, look at that. It's 9.8 meters per second squared, right? So when they get into Cavendish and they have the mass of the balls, right? That's literally them putting in the little g, that ratio, just how fast it falls. It doesn't mean mass attracting mass or anything like that. It's just ratio, right? To get the weight, the balls, to get the mass. Now, when they took that and the torque angle from those balls, they were like, "Oh, that must mean there must be this much amount of gravitational force influenced by the Earth, and if there's this much gravitational influence, this must mean that the Earth weighs this much." Right? So then they came up with these two constants, big G and big M, for the mass of Earth and the gravitational force between them. Body. So they took that, and then when you apply those constants to Kepler's laws, apply it to the periodicity of the sun, well, you'll algebraically be able to work out how much the sun's mass has to be for to produce that effect based on the periodicity, right? Which gives distance, because that's how long it would take to complete a ratio of pi. And from that, they were like, okay, so now we have a dynamic explanation for why things move by. It's because the sun has this much mass in relation to, the Earth's mass, and it produces 30 coulomb second velocity component, et cetera, et cetera. And then they just took those ratios, every planet's periodicity, they just ratioed that against the sun's mass and gravity, and that's how they introduced Newtonian dynamics to the sky as a function of mass attracting mass as a force. Is that your question?
Yeah, exactly. Yep. So thank you for that, sir. All right, we can continue. Obviously, Newton's a whole entire rabbit hole, and I will say, people are like, they think that we have so much going on. Why is this important? Dude, the biggest fear of the powers that be is an informed public that understands these concepts, because then what ends up happening is you pop in an ether cosmology casual discussion one night on their Discord, or talking about how, well, actually the speed of light is nothing more than the perceived rate of illumination. It's actually a rate of induction. And so you have an ether perturbation. So then we can utilize that understanding to then progress technologically. Like the gems that come out of this are for me, not thee type of thing in their mind. And then there's
Exactly. The 600 plus patents that we're not allowed to see, and the technology is not allowed to come out. Granted, probably most of them are military, but I guarantee there are well over a dozen that are all about free energy.
Dude, you're swimming in a field of endless potential.
It never stops.
Yeah.
It never stops.
Like, dude, think about that. They're like, we can't use electric cars because it takes so long to charge. It's like there should be no charging.
Right.
So, this is of major importance. Obviously, it also has the philosophical implications of intelligent design. So, all right, cool. If you guys are down, we'll move from Newton.
Absolutely.
We're obviously about to hit the big rabbit hole here.
For moving waves. But a few centuries later, an experiment was conducted by Michelson and Morley to detect an ether, and the experiment used something called an interferometer. Now, the bummer part about it is it failed to detect an ether.
Sorry, dude. What a bummer.
Yeah, so okay.
So real quick, dude. It failed to detect the velocity component that would be mandatory if heliocentrism were true in relation to Kepler's laws and Newtonian dynamics, right? The reframing of it as it failed to detect a jar of ether or something like that is right. This is a missing velocity component. That's what the experiment was actually about. It was like how much light would be affected due to motion, because they already experimentally established that the translational velocity of water affects the light propagation to the degree of 88%, 44% going with and 44% going against. So this idea that it failed to detect the ether is insane, right? I hope this guy includes Sagnac in his experiment and see what that guy failed to detect. That's crazy, right? But it's a simple reframing that works for, like, if you take it at face value, you're like, oh yeah, failed to detect the ether, got it. But it didn't. It failed to detect the velocity necessary to confirm heliocentrism and what they were saying about the motion, the bodies in the sky.
If all our wacky, crazy theories are correct, there can be no ether.
Yep.
Yeah, pretty much. And so that you guys don't have to take his word for it, here's Albert Einstein. The second class of facts to which we have alluded has reference to the question whether or not the motion of the Earth in space can be made perceptible in terrestrial experiments. We've already remarked in section 5 that all attempts of this nature led to a negative result. Before the theory of relativity was put forward, what does that mean? The theory of relativity supposedly saved them from the negative results. The negative results of what? Attempting to test and measure or detect the motion of the Earth with a terrestrial experiment. Before the theory of relativity was put forward, it was difficult to become reconciled to this negative result. For reasons to now be discussed, the inherited prejudices about time and space did not allow any doubt to arise as to the prime importance of the Galilean transformation for changing over from one body of reference to another. And this is where you get into time and space, this different implementation of those concepts to save people from the problem. And then I'll quickly say here, in one of the most notable of these attempts, which attempts? An attempt to detect the motion of the Earth terrestrially via experiment. Michelson devised a method which appears as though it must be decisive. So he ends up contradicting himself here, because if it must be decisive, then you can't really invoke an error margin, right? I mean, and the reason is because it's over 10 times more sensitive than it needed to be to detect it, the motion that should have been there. And so yeah, when you go down here, you'll see that it didn't just get rid of the ether, because the original proposal here, the experiment gave a negative result, a fact very perplexing to physicists. Lorentz and Fitzgerald rescued this theory from difficulty by assuming that the motion of the body relative to the ether produces a contraction of the body in the direction of motion, which means the people that actually came up with the first attempt that seemed like it could possibly be viable to escape this problem, to save them from this difficulty, as Albert Einstein says, was Lorentz and Fitzgerald, who used an ether theory to do so. This modern narrative that, like, oh, they got the results and the ether must be done away with, is laughably inept. Okay, it isn't the case. Or why would Einstein himself be saying that, Lorentz and Fitzgerald rescue this theory? This theory, the theory being that the earth is moving. That's the theory, that the earth is moving through an ether. And then, of course, long story short, well, we'll get more into it in a second. So, all right. Let's put it back up here. It's so annoying that they just say that. They just say, like, it disproved the ether. It failed to detect the ether. It's like, what? It was trying to detect an interference pattern based on the earth moving through an ether. All right.
And to be clear, right, real quick before we move on, they did measure a velocity. Right now, their conceptualization was that the ether is static, movable. Now, if you have a stationary Earth and you have a dynamic ether, i.e., an ether wind that follows sidereal time, which is what is measured in interferometry, right? Those fluctuations throughout the day. You plot those min-max peaks against a timeline of 23 hours and 56 minutes for sidereal time. It makes a nice sine wave. When you apply it to 24 hours, it makes an incoherent pattern that doesn't mean anything. So they're all measuring the rotation of the stars. And what Miller found, kind of getting off a little bit, but what Miller found was that also annually the position of the sun affects the maximum that they measure, which is what he found on the equinoxes when it's moving fastest and slowest.
Correct. Yep. And that's why they'll tell you it was a null result. But it wasn't an actual null result, as Alan just said. They rounded down. That's so scientific. We can't.
Yeah, just
we really can't have
down.
this. Yeah, we can't have this number just round to zero, boys. That's science, bro. All right. I'm sure y'all say some more things that need to be objected.
To detect an ether. And further experiments, even beyond Michelson and Morley, which also use interferometers to be able to detect an ether, also failed. So it showed there was nothing wrong with the experiment or the apparatus that Michelson and Morley were using. It just said, hey, there's no ether. Which meant by the 1900s, physicists had to conclude that the ether did not exist, and they built particle physics theories without it. But if there's only empty...
Okay. Shut up, bro. All right. So he just breezed right past these conclusions, these baseless assertions, but just to make sure everyone knows really simply, they were supposed to get a specific value if the Earth was moving through a stationary ether. They didn't get that value. But they did get a value. They did get a fringe shift, an interference pattern, a separation of where the light beams were. The light beams got to the receiver at different times. Although they were originally the same exact light beam and it was split into two, so they were perfectly in phase with each other. They then split in the middle, reflected back off silvered mirrors to the middle, then went to the destination, the receiver. They got there at different times. If the Earth is moving, then you're going to be able to detect its motion of 30 kilometers a second with how much the light beams are separated, because the motion of the Earth is affecting the travel of one of the light beams. Okay, they didn't get what they expected, but they did get something. The best that they could do after years of struggling was to come up with some completely nonsensical, paradoxical, fallacious theory as to why it would be zero or should be zero. And that is that space and time bend and warp and distances contract and time slows down and the apparatus contracts, but so does all the air and the entire earth and everything on it, blah, blah, blah. But it wasn't actually even zero. And that's the part that no one's going to tell you, except for like, us, like our group of people. And so that's called lying by omission. All right.
The space in the universe, and light has known wave properties. The question is, what is waving? The answer in physics is, all right, light is a particle, it's a photon, but that still is problematic because in that photon there are still wavelengths that describe light and other types of waves. Light has different colors, red versus blue are different wavelengths. So still, even in a photon, something has to describe what causes those different waves and wavelengths. And every other known wave has a medium. A medium is a substance which allows the wave to travel. A sound wave.
Okay, correction. Every other known wave is the medium. It is the medium. So, Zach, you have a really good, simple way to put this. Do you wanna drop your bars about it being a wave is a noun, not a verb. I mean, a verb, not a noun.
Yeah. Well, you have to have something in order for it to wave. You can't, it's not like even waving your hand, right? Your hand is there. It's moving. There is no... I'm having trouble with this one.
No, it's good. You always say this. You say you can wave your hand, but you can't hand a wave.
Yes, there you go.
Yeah, exactly. And it's simple, right? When we have waves in the ocean, well, actually, what you have is the ocean moving. You can get sand on your towel at the beach. You can wave off the sand, right? But you're moving the towel. The towel is moving. The water is moving. Sound is a medium, typically air, right? Air is moving in a transverse way. We call it a wave, but it's actually the air waving. Sound is just the movement of a medium. The ocean wave is just the movement of the water. The towel is just the movement of the towel. When you make your bed and you wave the sheets, you're moving the sheets. You can't have a wave without the sheets, without the towel, without the water, without the air. Okay? So this is called special pleading. To claim now that light is the exception to a universal principle is called special pleading. You're claiming basically an anomaly to a universal principle. It is a fallacy because it's stupid. Okay? So he is at least kind of making this point. And the reason I'm playing this video is although I was just listening to the background, I think it's pretty interesting. You guys will see in a second.
Travels through air, a water wave travels through water, an earthquake, a seismic wave travels through Earth, the material of Earth. We'll get into a little bit more detail here. A water wave is the motion of water molecules, literally H2O molecules. It's a vibrational pattern. And a sound wave is the motion of air molecules. Air is the medium in this case. And so if every other wave has a medium, we have to ask again, does the ether exist? And if it does exist, why was it not detected in experiments, including the Michelson-Morley experiment?
And look, dude, just to do this, here's the actual Michelson-Morley paper. People will say it has nothing to do with the motion of the Earth. You can see here, the title is literally On the Relative Motion of Earth. On the relative motion of the Earth and the luminiferous ether. And he does not say there is no ether. What he does is erroneously, well, I guess you could say it's somewhat valid. He says in conclusion, right, that basically if you round down to zero, you classify it as a null result. That what this has shown is that the previous theory of a stationary ether can't be true. Whereas, which I would actually take no contention with that. What about you, Alan?
Sorry, last part you said?
Do you take any contention with the exclusion of the ether being stationary after the results of Michelson-Morley?
Yeah, if you argue that it's stationary, if you scroll up to the top part, that first paragraph, like the introduction, halfway through, he's talking about the hypothesis of a fixed unmovable ether in regards to Airy's failure and how they could rectify that, and it would be possible that telescope didn't require a correction angle. Now, what he says here, yeah, read that right there. Actually, I'll read it. Where the tangent of the angle of aberration is to the ratio of the velocity of Earth to the velocity of light, then since the latter velocity is in water, 3/4 of its velocity in a vacuum, the aberration observed with the water in the telescope should be 4/3 its true value. And scroll down on just a tad. Yep, for that cross right there. So there's a special note there, and he goes on to say, it may be noticed that most writers admit the sufficiency of the explanation according to the emission theory of light, while in fact the difficulty is even greater according to the undulatory theory. So there were two competing theories at the time. One was like light was like a corpuscle, like a little ballistic projectile in little chunks, and then the other theory was that it was a wave. Now, he's going to go on, and that's the undulatory theory. So he goes on to say, where the emission theory of the velocity of light must be greater in the water of the telescope, and therefore the angle of the aberration should be less. Hence, in order to reduce it to its true value, one must make the absurd hypothesis that the motion of the water in the telescope carries the light in the opposite direction. So there were two proposed mechanisms for this, and one of them was by Stokes. I forget who the other one was, but for the emission theory, for the ballistic projectile, you would have to argue that when the light hits the water, it somehow starts accelerating by 30 kilometers a second as to compensate for Earth's velocity, which is, an insane, absurd hypothesis, to quote Michelson. And then if you were an undulatory lad, you have to say that the light was carried in the opposite direction of motion in the water, which would, cancel out the velocity component, which is crazy. And because their original hypothesis was that the ether was static and didn't move, and the only way Stokes could propose that this would work to carry it in the opposite direction is he had to say that, well, inside the telescope, the ether becomes mobile and it's bouncing around and carrying it in the opposite direction, which, Michelson points out here is quite absurd.
Thank you for that, sir. So there you go. And this is a perfect example of how just ridiculous scientism is. Like, everyone repeats that Michelson-Morley disproved the ether had nothing to do with the motion of the Earth. And it's like you have to literally just not read the title or the first paragraph to say something that ridiculous. Well, yeah, very very interesting context there for you guys. That goes back to Airy's failure that we discussed earlier, and that is what brought them to this test. And that's why everyone was so excited about it, because it was actually very ingenious. When I say I take no contention with the exclusion of a stationary ether, is because, well, there was actually. So I don't take contention with his conclusion, just not the way he came to the conclusion, because there actually was a detection of a fringe shift. There was some type of motion affecting the propagation of light. Something was moving, right?
Yep.
And it's a movement in the ether.
Yeah, and he goes on to say at the end of his paper that, if they're to take these measurements as they are in the first order, that the velocity between the Earth and there would have to be much less than what was predicted. Scroll down a little more. More. One. Oh, it's coming up. Scroll up. We're at the go up more. Okay, we're at the supplement. Go up one. One more. Yeah, right there is where he's talking about it. Into it. So those are the predicted values for the fringes. To get 30 kilometers a second would be 0.05 of a fringe, and they measured just over one fringe. And then, so those are the predicted values. So the solid line is the actual measurement, and the dotted line is the predicted value. And then here he's giving the velocities right here. So it says, hence the displacement to be expected was 0.4 fringes. The actual displacement was certainly less than a 20th of the part of this and probably less than a 40th of the part. But since the displacement is proportional to the square of the velocity, and the relative velocity of the Earth and the ether is probably less than 1/6 of Earth's orbital velocity, and certainly less than 1/4. And what precedes only the orbital motion of the Earth is considered. If this is combined with the motion of the solar system, concerning which but little is known about with certainty, the results would have to be modified, and was and it would just be possible that the resultant velocity at the time of the observation was small, though the chances are much against it. This experiment must be therefore repeated at intervals of 3 months to test the uncertainty to be avoided. Right. So what he's saying there is that maybe everything's moving together and we don't know. What we should do is take measurements throughout the every 3 months, right? So that they'll line up with the equinoxes and they'll get variances, minimum and maximum peaks to see if what their measurement was in air. Because this is only 6 days of measurements, boys. They redefined all of physics over this, and he was saying that in order for us to truly know, based on the conceptualization of our model, the Earth is going to be at different locations throughout the year. It's going to be aligned with different velocity vectors, so that it's going to experience velocity addition, which would increase these readings more. Maybe we should continue this out, and they never did it. They never continued the series of experiments. Only our boy Dayton Miller picked up and where these guys left off. And shout out to Edward Morley. He was Miller's lab assistant for many years through his work, but he actually continued these measurements throughout the years, and making sure that he was taking measurements on the equinoxes and all these things where the Earth would be in different alignments with these velocities and increase the readings. Now he did get an increase in readings, but none of them were ever uh, to the degree that would confirm heliocentrism. Then when he started doing interferometer measurements at altitude, he got even stronger readings, indicating that the source of the motion is coming from the sky.
Yep. Then the next part was, it says, it appears from all that precedes reasonably certain that if there be any relative motion between the Earth and luminiferous ether, it must be small, quite small enough entirely to refute Fresnel's explanation of aberration. And so this is the problem, bro. It's like if they were detecting Earth's motion, the Earth is like crawling around the sun in relation to what people claim it's doing, which is not an option, obviously, because we have specific astronomical observations. If the Earth is supposedly a sphere that's tilted and wobbling and rotating and revolving, it has to be doing so at corresponding velocities. It isn't optional. Claim a certain size of a sphere, and then it's going to turn once a day. It has to go a certain speed, right? Specifically 1,037 miles per hour at the equator, and then, different velocities relative to latitudes. And then same thing with the orbit. You have a very specific velocity. It must be moving. So this is why it was the greatest failed experiment, quote unquote, in history. The reason that's one of the most famous failed experiment and had the biggest implications on physics of probably any experiment in modern times, not even close, is because it threw a wrench in the entire system, the entire assumptions, all the assumptions up to that point. This is us. This is a still, man. This is an accurate representation of what happened. So why does the mainstream have to lie about it? Why do goofs like who made this video just blindly regurgitate the lie? And it's simple. It's because the actual evidence is damning. So, and then Alan just pointed out that, so then Edward Morley actually helps Dayton Miller. Dayton Miller keeps on replicating it for years and years, taking literally millions of measurements. And he actually ends up showing that there's a direct correlation between when you get these fringe shifts and the time of year, solar motion. So seasons, equinoxes, solstices, all right? You had maximum and minimum falling on corresponding equinoxes, which makes no sense if it's the Earth moving causing it. Now, it does make perfect sense. If the Earth's not moving, right? The sun is moving, the stuff in the sky is moving, and there's an ether it moves through. And that's the only way it can make sense. And Einstein himself said that if Dayton Miller's results are correct, that his entire theory collapses like a house of cards.
Yep. And the reason for that is, you guys, there's a distinction here, right, with the interferometer measurements. These are first order measurements of velocity. Length contraction and time dilation are second order effects that are much smaller, and they're the result of a velocity. So you can't that's why Miller's work can't be even acknowledged as like, "Oh, well, he just measured the velocity, but it's just a little less or whatever for some unknown reason." If you were to say like, "Oh, maybe the ether is entrained in the earth and, there's, some deviation there or whatever," well, then you can't definitively say anything about the sky in the speed of in regards to using the speed of light as a yardstick, because if it's not constant here on Earth, then yeah, how are you gonna apply it to the sky and tell me based on XYZ of the constancy of C, then, that's what you're using to make measurements for everything. That's why it was super important to deny Miller's work and make sure that it never, saw the light of day, because these velocities can't be explained as a function of link contraction and time dilation. It's not, "Oh, we're moving at 30 kilometers a second, but we're link contracted so much that it only measures 8." No, no, you measure 0 in your frame. So, because the speed of light is constant. So these could never be measured or, addressed or in their entirety, because it's a first order refutation to their entire paradigm.
Correct. Yep. And because we did bring up the part where he actually distinguishes and elucidates the differences in the undulatory and the particle interpretation of light, we do have this question here from Mark Allen: light, particle, or wave?
Wave.
Alan, yeah.
Wave.
Yeah.
The particle aspect of it, right? It doesn't come from the double slit experiment. It doesn't come from the quantum eraser. It doesn't come from the which way experiment. When you do the double slit experiment, no one has ever seen the pattern that corresponds to light being a particle, no matter what you do to manipulate the independent variables. Like if you introduce ambient heat sources, if you introduce your human consciousness or not, doesn't matter. It's never been shown to be the particle pattern. And when they get to the which way experiment, they actually split the beam and then have it go to two different detectors. When you look at the detectors separately, you're like, "Oh my god, there's the particle pattern. It must have retroactively went back in time and changed which slit it went through." Nope. If you combine those two detectors, they make the same coherent fringe pattern that it does in the double slit experiment. It's all just a mystic ruse. I highly recommend checking out Sabina Hoffenfelder's, I think that's her name, Hoffensetterfelder or whatever. Check out her video on quantum eraser. She spills the beans. It's just a trick. It's not a real concept. Nothing goes back in time and retroactively changes its position or anything like that. They've only ever seen the wave, right? If you have a little tiny sphere blocking a beam of light, the beam of light will diffract around the sphere and recombine and put a little dot directly behind the sphere, on like a canvas behind the sphere, right? That's the Arago effect. No one would. There's no explanation for that as a particle. No one's ever like. This is why they abandoned the ballistic light theory. But then anyway, Einstein comes through. I forget the year for this paper, but he proposes that light is actually little quantized chunks, and he's using Planck's constant, which was derived for black body radiation, and it's basically the smallest amount of energy that can exist over a 1 second period from some black body radiation experiments and measurements that they were doing. So he introduces that as like a function of the frequency, where it's like, um, this is how many little baby dots exist, to facilitate like the particle aspect of it. Instead of being a wave, it's quantized chunks, based off of Planck's constant. And then that was quote unquote experimentally verified by a guy named Arthur Compton in 1925 or 1926, I want to say. And with that, when you start with the wave momentum of a wave, right? You start off with the wave momentum equation, and then they algebraically shuffle in Planck's constant, and they say, and then they move out the wave component aspect of it, and they're like, "Look, boys, this is only predictable by special relativity and quantized chunks in the interaction for Compton scattering," which I'm not going to get into because it's a whole separate thing. But just real quickly, um, the if you can algebraically shuffle it in, well, you can algebraically shuffle it out, no problem. And got some documentation on that. But more importantly, the way that they say that the way that they base the calculations on, additionally, like aside from the making it a quantized chunk, the way they describe the interaction for the scattering effect is that they say that the photon, one of these little quantized chunks, hits a stationary electron, and because they assert the stationariness, they use the stationary mass of it for the kinetic energy exchange between the two ballistic particles hitting each other, right? I- And if you use the rest mass of an electron, that creates an artificial deficit in the kinetic energy for the scattering angle. And they're like, "Oh, this can't be explained if light is a wave, right?" This, but nothing in their paradigm is ever at rest. That's not even a real concept. It's just a mathematical derivation of what the mass would be if it was at rest. They impose that condition on the measurement to create a deficit so that they could say that it's only explainable through light being a quantized chunk of energy, and that's insane. But the whole thing is based off of, only looking at it through that lens, and that's the actual experimental verification of quote unquote how light could propagate through a vacuum without being a wave and not requiring a medium because it's actually been quote unquote confirmed as quantized little chunks. And
Yeah.
due to wave particle duality, when your consciousness makes it collapse into a wave for some reason. But yeah, it's literally all based off of imposing conditions that only lend itself to relativity theory, and then further extrapolating, imposing relativistic math for vector momentum on the interaction between these two ballistic particles, one moving, one stationary, which isn't even a tenable position. Um, but that's how it's all done, and how it's moved forward through the mainstream.
Nice. And the reason you get the wave particle duality, which is a paradoxical nonsense statement, and there's not dualities in nature, but is because, for one, they need the particle for the reason that he just elucidated. And then what happens is when you run into actual observational evidence, they have to be able to flip flop back over and claim, well, oh, it was a wave then. For example, even in the double slitter quantum eraser, where they have to basically, if it was just a particle, they'd have to claim that the particle actually collided with itself. Literally. So they're like, oh, well, no, it's a wave then. And this video I'm showing on the stream is the easiest way to refute the idea that light's a particle. If little particles called photons are flying through these lenses, and then right here we see at the beginning of this video that the light's blocked out, right? As you put the as you cross polarize the lenses. So you see that the light's not coming through, it's blocked out. You can't see the little white object in the background. Then you bring an additional lens in, and at a specific angle, you can see what's there again. So supposedly these physical photons that are physically traveling from point to point are being blocked by lenses, and then you just add another one, all of a sudden they make it through what was blocking it. That doesn't make any sense. That can't be a physical particle traveling from point to point. You can look up quantum Venn diagram paradox. And I will say, this is my opinion on light. Similar to what Tesla said, light can be nothing more than a sound wave in the ether. Light is actually an excitation of the background medium called the ether, similar to how if you had shoes that would light up when you ran, or those little balls that would come out of the gumball machines, the little toys, and as you bounce it, it then lights up. That's basically the ether. It gets excited, and once it's excited, specifically, there's a perturbation, there's a disturbance, and once it's excited, it lights up. It's just a background medium. Light is the ether. If it's not, again, it's special pleading. It has to be, because waves are not nouns. They are verbs. That is a verb. It is waving. Okay, so that is a modality, a version of the ether. It's an excited version of the ether that becomes perceivable. It illuminates. It has a rate at which it illuminates. And then because we see it light up, we say, oh, well, look how fast it lights up. And it to us, it's like, oh, it's traveling, because if we see the process of illumination, the rate at which it induces, and we think, oh, it's traveling, it's speed as in point A to point B travel. And we quantify it that way. And it's useful, absolutely. But it is nothing more than excitation or a perturbation of the background. Now, that's my opinion, but I think that's pretty solid. I think it's the only truly viable way to interpret it. And don't get it twisted. I'm not claiming to fully understand the nature of light. I absolutely do not fully understand it. But so anyway, that is my take. And that is a good question. And that is a 5-hour stream in and of itself. I mean, in fact, it's like an entire docu-series in and of itself, to be honest. But thanks for the question. All right, and this will open up another can of worms here.
And so if every other wave has a medium, we have to ask again, does the ether exist? And if it does exist, why was it not detected in experiments, including the Michelson-Morley experiment? And the explanation starts with this, right? Shortly after the Michelson-Morley experiment, Hendrik Lorentz suggested that the experiment, the interferometer, failed to consider length contraction. By the way, this is a Nobel Prize winner, and the Lorentz factor later was used by Einstein in relativity, and it can explain.
Do I really have to point out that everything you just said was a fallacy? Like, oh, he was a Nobel Prize winner, appeal to authority, appeal to credentials. Even though he was a genius, by the way. This guy was pretty on point.
Failed to consider the unfalsifiable hypothesis that you're contracted and dilated in your frame, thus you can never actually measure your velocity. Like, that's insane, dude.
He then attributes personification to inanimate objects and said that the apparatus failed to consider that it was contracting. What are you talking about? And then its substantiation was that it was later used in relativity, which we just showed. Relativity is special and general theory. The more simple summary paper from Einstein where he explained both of the theories and what all it entails. Specifically, we said Lorentz and Fitzgerald, right? So you have Hendrik Lorentz here. So, like Einstein told you, like this saved them from the difficulty. I'll let him say a couple more things, then I want to read a quote.
Length contraction. Now, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, it would have been difficult to build an experiment that considers length contraction, but computer simulations now are able to do it.
It would have been difficult to build an experiment to verify length contraction, but now computer simulations can do it. Now we have the experiment of a computer simulation.
And what you see here on the left
yeah, that's an scientific experiment if I've ever seen one.
Is exactly what Michelson-Morley witnessed. There was no phase detection in the wave, in the light wave for the splitter there.
That's a lie, though. There literally was a phase shift detected.
But if you consider a interferometer that is in motion, you do see that phase detection as a result of length contraction. And remember, the Earth is always moving. It's the cause of length contraction is that not only is the Earth spinning, but it's also going around the sun, it's going around the galaxy, but more importantly, it's moving at a very fast velocity in the universe relative to other galaxies.
Which is funny you brought that up, because they didn't account for this at all. In fact, at the time, they didn't even know about it, didn't even claim it, right? The idea that not only is it orbiting, but it's also moving through our galaxy at like half, the sun's supposedly moving through our galaxy at 500,000 miles per hour, as our galaxy moves through space at like 1.2 million miles per hour. So where did they account for that? Because Einstein didn't account for it. So whenever it's like, oh, this ingenious correction of contraction based on the relative motion, and it just so happens to precisely contract the exact amount to sufficiently compensate for the missing time difference that should have been there. Well, okay, so then you were wrong, right? Because now we have 500,000 miles per hour. Now we have 1.2 million miles per hour that you didn't account for. So now I guess like the fundamental component or like mechanism is different, because the rate at which it changes relative to a velocity must now be different, since our velocities didn't originally account for. But I want to read this here. James Coleman, well-respected physicist, he explains this, and he says, the easiest explanation was that the Earth was fixed in the ether and that everything else in the universe moved with respect to Earth and the ether. Such an idea was not considered seriously, since it would mean in effect that our Earth occupied the omnipotent position in the universe, with all the other heavenly bodies paying homage by moving around it. Again, that's physicist James Coleman. It was not considered seriously because it would mean the Earth occupied a special position in the universe. How is that science? Okay, and this is why I brought him up. He then goes on to explain. The explanation, which had the most appeal in accounting for the negative result of the Michelson-Morley experiment, was one that was literally dreamed up for that purpose. It is the so-called Fitzgerald-Lorentz contraction. In 1893, Fitzgerald suggested that all objects contracted in the direction of their motion through the ether. He reasoned that if ordinary objects flattened out upon impact with other objects, a rubber ball hitting a wall or a ripe tomato dropped on the floor, for example, then why would it not be possible for objects that move through the ether to have the force of the ether push them in or contract them? This would adequately explain the results of the Michelson-Morley experiment. The arm of the interferometer moving against the ether would be shortened so that even though the light wave traveling in that particular arm might be slowed down by the ether wind, this would be compensated for by having its path shortened. Objections to the Fitzgerald-Lorentz contraction hypothesis were rampant, as was to be expected, not only because there was no evidence to prove that such an effect actually took place, but particularly because Fitzgerald could not explain why objects would contract due to motion through the ether. The contraction hypothesis was originally advanced only as a possible explanation for Michelson and Morley's results, providing such an effect existed. Then, too, the theory said that all materials traveling with the same velocity with respect to the ether would contract the same fractional amount. Since iron is much heavier and stronger than wood, for example, one would expect a greater contraction for wood than for iron, but this too went unanswered. This is James Coleman, professor of physics and chairman of the Department of Physics at the American International College, Springfield, Massachusetts, in Relativity for the Layman. So, a couple important parts there. Obviously, at a fundamental problem with the idea that all material would be contracted the same, despite, say, its density or strength, right? And that makes no sense because he was actually invoking a physical interaction. He also didn't propose an actual specific causal mechanism of how the ether was contracting the objects. It's even worse now because they don't even have the substantive ether to invoke as part of the reason why things contract. They've just removed that. And so now it's just this woo-woo, undefined idea and it just happens. Trust me, bro. And in 2024, there is not one single legitimate proposed causal mechanism for length contraction. It's not even proposed. It hasn't even been proposed. No one has even come up with a theoretical causal mechanism for length contraction. People believe it's a definitive fact. And they'll tell you, yeah, we know it's motion. No, that's not a physical causal mechanism. It is admitted. Einstein said it very clearly. I have no idea. No one's ever come up with anything. And so James Coleman, props to him, he adequately explains what happened. And he says, actually the most obvious answer was that the Earth's not moving in respect to the ether, which is moving. Everything's moving around the Earth, but that was disregarded. It wasn't taken as a possibility because it would mean the Earth is in a special and unique position with everything else paying homage to it. All right. So it was disregarded entirely. And then, 6 years later, someone came in 1893, Fitzgerald tried to save the problem. And he said, look, I can't explain this. I don't know a causal mechanism. I know there's inconsistencies. I don't know how it would affect all the materials at the same way. There's no actual evidence for this at all. But, in theory, maybe this would explain why. This would give us the same mathematical results that we weren't expecting, even if the Earth were moving. Later, what they did, and then I'll stop saying so much. Later, what they did was a test where they actually took two different size arms to test Fitzgerald's theory. All right. And they were like, okay, well, we'll see that the longer arm actually got shorter and matches the shorter arm at the end of the test. And we'll be able to verify this length contraction idea. And of course, it didn't. And so it was ruled out. And the reason it was ruled out is because it was actually testable. It was falsifiable. You could actually go see, did the arm actually change size? So what did Einstein do? He took that completely made up, unfounded, baseless claim, integrated it into his theory, didn't offer a causal mechanism, removed the physical interaction with an ether altogether because he removed the actual ether background as was known altogether, and then just touted victory. And of course, the reason that it remained was because it is literally unfalsifiable. You can't test it. In his version of it, it changed, but it's going to look like it's exactly the same. And there's no way to ever know. And if you measured it before and after, they would both measure the exact same size. They would measure the exact same distance. But trust me, it contracted. You just can't tell because whatever you're using to measure it contracted. Everything contracted. So it's going to all still look the same. That's the reason that it was touted as some solution, because it couldn't have been falsified. So now you guys know what actually happened, right? I mean, it would take you years to find this. And that should make you wonder, like, why is this so suppressed? So, all right, cool. I know that was a lot, but I like to throw James Coleman in there because he summarizes
Yeah.
it pretty well.
Just to add on a little bit to that, the removal of the physical mechanism that would do the compression, right, was replaced by the idea that there's no absolute time or space, and that distance and time are relative functions of your velocity squared over c squared, and that they will change as as to that function, which is equally disgusting and insane. Like the physical mechanism, right, is that time is changing, not just an apparent change or something like that, like a Doppler shift or something, but it's physically different in the moving frame relative to the stationary frame or the other, co-moving observer, whatever, for it to be an inertial reference framing as well. They're saying that they're in two different timelines, right? It's crazy.
Yeah, exactly. And some people will say it's just like an illusion. It just appears to change, but it doesn't actually change because they don't understand relativity. But Einstein had actually came out and spoke out against it. And he said, many people are misinterpreting my theory to claim that the length contraction is just optical. It's just apparent, but it's not real. It's just an illusion. He said that's not the case. It has to be actual and physical, and that it could be measured.
Yeah. I got a quote from his paper in 1926 when he was addressing this. Somebody was stepping and was like, "Yo, is this even real mechanisms? How do you substantiate this?" And he goes on to say that that it is a physical mechanism, and it would be hypothetically measurable, and don't discount it as like a fake mechanism, like as like a philosophical thing, because what they kind of teach it now is because like obviously it's preposterous, right? But they've taught people now that, like, oh, it's a hypothetical apparent contraction and dilation. In your frame, you're still like the same distance and length and time and all that, but to the apparent observer, that's where it would be different. And it's like, no. If if it's not physical in the moving frame, then they're not different in the way that relativity requires for that temporal divergence between the two frames, right? If they're not physically different, then time and space are absolute. You concede. So that's why Einstein, corrected this. Oh, sorry, it was in 1911 when he corrected this, not 1925. So yeah, he was like, no, these are definite real mechanisms. Time and space are definitely different in the moving frame, and you would be able to measure it.
Exactly. And dude, just ask yourself, why is what they tell you so different than what actually happened? Why do they tell you mass attracts mass when that was thrown away in the heliocentric paradigm over a century ago? Why do they tell you that when they teach you this even in college about the length contraction? Well, it's just it's like an apparent effect. It's an illusion. When it specifically can't be, it has to be actual and physical and in theory measurable, even according to Einstein himself. It's a requirement because, like he said, the actual consequences of you claiming it's just apparent is absolute space. Right? Why do they lie to you and say that the Michelson-Morley just disproved the ether? So you should ask yourself, wait a minute. Why are they lying? And by the way, the further you go into it, the more it's every single part of it. It's like, oh, the proofs of time dilation, atomic clock decay, lie. Oh, the verification of relativity, 1919 Arthur Eddington experiment, lie. Like, oh, it predicted the Mercury perihelion shift, lie. But it can explain it, lie. It's all lie. When you have to constantly lie, whether by overtly telling untruths or lying by omission, when what you're presenting is a lie. So anyway, all right, cool. There's a few more minutes here.
And while that doesn't prove an ether, it could explain why it was failed to be detected. But this is the reason why I am so passionate about the ether, is this simple equation. This simple equation in energy wave theory calculates particle energies, calculates forces, but without that one symbol that you see there that is highlighted, everything fails. There are no calculations. It is not possible. And that symbol is a density property. And density implies waves that are traveling in a medium. It's a given mass per volume unit. So perhaps there is an ether.
Wow, I did not know that.
If the ether does exist,
That's crazy.
here's the strange.
Dude, they have the density in the equation.
Dude, it's so funny the mental gymnastics this guy goes through this video because he knows there has to be an ether.
Oh my god, dude, what a homie. I can't wait to dive into that later. That's so awesome. I did not know that. It's in the dude. Thank you.
Yeah, crazy.
Thing about it, more than a century of particle physics has been built on a missing but extremely critical property of the universe. And even this man, Einstein, he was not opposed to the ether. In fact, he's quoted on a handful of times saying that the ether could exist. Ether, in fact, he's.
We may assume the existence of an ether, only we must give up ascribing a definite state of motion to it.
I'm blown away by that density in the wave equation. Because if you take the magnetic permeability and electric permittivity and magnetic permeability, you can turn that into a density gradient. That's what Asatovsky did to make his ether model. So that's so crazy, dude. It's been there the whole time. Like the physical impedance of the electric permittivity and magnetic permeability. Like obviously those are physical properties. And then you can turn that into a density gradient. That's, I mean, what? Can't wait to hear what the explanations are, what the apologetics are going to be for this.
Yeah, I can't even think of one right now. So sure it'll be something. So it's all relative, bro. So cool. We can run through some of the questions. Obviously, although we
He definitely just closed his tab mid-sentence, huh?
Yeah, he did. We lost him. Is that the whole stream down then?
Yeah, I think we're still live.
Because my stream tab just disappeared. No, it didn't. Okay, I see it. Okay. Well, I hope Austin's all right. That was quite sudden.
Ether got him. Yeah, some pretty profound implications there. And like Austin was saying before he DC'd, you have to just basically accept and regurgitate the mainstream interpretation. Because if you start reading these papers for yourself and you start looking at the measurements and the actual data, the conclusions that were drawn from them, it doesn't line up. And if you take it to its logical conclusion, right, the implications go all the way back to Newtonian dynamics and Kepler trying to explain motion of the bodies in the sky.
Yeah, and it's amazing that they've known this for how long now? Forever. That everything they tried to do to show that the Earth is in motion and moving, that it fails. Yet they bend over backwards and make up things just out of thin air to justify being able to still say that. Well, why isn't this out there more? Why isn't this, why doesn't everybody know this? Did you know that Rockefeller creates the textbooks for cheaper and they sell them to the schools for cheaper than it costs to make them? So they'd charge you $20 to make this textbook, right? And the Rockefellers too, but they sell them for $5. Nobody can compete with that. So getting the information out there to people, it's not really possible unless you do it like we're doing it.
Yeah. Crazy, man, because I read a lot of papers, and like when it comes to something about Michelson-Morley, they always have like the same standard issue comment, like regurgitated straight from the textbook, where it's just like, well, they did the test for the ether and found that the speed of light was constant, so now I'm gonna move into this relativistic framework and talk about that, and it's like, oh, dude, what? Yeah, like just read. Like, you just know they've never read it for themselves or internalized it or thought about it because
Or didn't understand what they were reading. I think that is so much of it.
yeah.
I thought a lot of
Yo, can
Hey,
you link me this
what's up,
video
boss?
later? Austin, this video you have playing in the background right now is awesome. I need it.
Yeah, I got you. I'll send you all of it. That was crazy. I don't know. I accidentally like side clicked on my mouse, one of the extra buttons, and just everything went blank. I was gone.
The kill switch.
Yeah, that's the only that's the only problem with the browser streaming. But okay, sorry. I'm gonna read some of the questions. If you guys want to support the stream, kofi.com/globebusters, ko-fi.com/globebusters. And I will check Rockfin tips and YouTube super chats as well. And let's read through some of these questions that we got. If you guys are down.
Absolutely.
All right. What about the different types of light? Fluorescent, LED, laser, or oil lamp? I don't know the context of your question, brother. What about it? I mean, you have different types of you have different levels of coherency. What that is. Coherencies, frequencies. All right. Does a gyroscope demonstrate Earth rotation if started while stationary, then monitored for 24 hours? Alan, you wanna take that pre-dunk?
Yeah, a laser. Yeah, so it measures, 15 degrees per hour. The thing with that, though, similar to James Bradley looking through his telescope, right? It's a measurement. Can't tell you if the Earth is in motion or if the sky is in motion. What have to do is introduce some new variables, like taking the interferometer to altitude. That, and if you get a higher reading, you would draw the conclusion that the source of the rotation, the sky, because you're picking up a faster velocity. The current paradigm, the way that they look at light through a constancy, and you have to invoke a geometrically convenient position and all these things, right? If you were to say that the Earth ball rotate is the cause of that, you have to look at it through the lens of 15 degrees per hour only, because it's the measurement is made with respect to absolute space in the case of rotation, where they do make the allowance because there's uh, all of that motion will be relative to a fixed point in the center of it, right? So what they invoke is a hypothetical frame at the center of all Earth, and that measurement has to maintain 15 degrees per hour because that's what it's with respect to. So if you start getting readings at altitude, you've immediately falsified uh, the causal mechanism of being Earth rotating.
Nice, yeah. Dang, I meant to try to get Airy because he came and he had to stay the whole time. Didn't get to say anything. I feel bad. Yeah, really similar. Michelson-Morley did detect a slight fringe shift. They tried to say it was a null result, but then you did the exact same type of test with the same exact equation, the same exact technology, same understanding of ether and C plus V, and then you can properly predict this ideal rotation that was used in Michelson-Gell-Pearson many years later, which is the same thing as ring laser gyros. So the only viable explanation is that the Earth is not moving and there is a singular motion that is the rotational motion of the sky, sidereal rotation. So the answer is no. It does the opposite. It falsifies the claim the Earth is moving. What was the relativistic explanation for Airy's experiment again? Oh, you want to take that one? What's the alleged relativistic explanation for Airy's success?
Yeah, they say that the water in the container doesn't carry a velocity potential, and when they apply relativistic velocity composition to, that predicts no movement, because the way that they internalize it is that with the relative motion, that it wouldn't be carrying that velocity potential. So they go, look, it predicts a 0, and they moved it 0, even though they moved it 0.8 arc seconds.
Yeah, there isn't one. There isn't a viable one.
Yeah, it's only explained through denying the 8, or I'm sorry, the 0.8 arc seconds, and then saying that due to relative motion and the isolating the water in its reference frame where it would have no velocity component to it. They're like, oh, well, I mean, there we go. Relativity is super correct, even not even addressing the actual measurement. Now they're rounding to the 0.
Kind of cut out at the end, but maybe you just finished right then. You're good.
Oh yeah, I was saying that they just rounded it to 0 again.
Yeah,
They can't address the actual measurement. They can't address Michelson-Morley. They can't address Aidan Miller's work in those repeated experiments by Hector Minera. There was a Yuri Galev. All those experiments, they have to be wrong, or have to, um, they're crackpots. You can't accept it. Blah blah blah. The speed of light's constant. Like, they can't even look at it, because if it's anything other than 0, then they're done.
Yeah, literally, it's such a just low IQ response. It's like, just round to 0. Because obviously, what a lot of the people are told to repeat, and what Wikipedia subsequent tests have shown that it is 0. That's what they'll claim. Like, oh, they just want to ignore all the more modern future tests that show that it actually is 0. And that's not true. First of all, none of the modern tests even get 0. None of them. But they'll claim, obviously, that the little bit they do detect is instrumental error. And we do know that, obviously, due to technological and human fallibility, there is always error, right? Potential for error. But that is not an adequate response. You want to give your take?
Yeah, to add on to the modern experiments that they do with an orthogonal interferometer, which just means that light is at a right angle to itself, following the Michelson-Morley design, and not a full closed loop like gyro or something like that. But thought, fortunate.
Well, what is your response to all these alleged experiments that have been done?
Sorry. Yeah, that was the point. Right. So when Miller continued on with his experiments, he found that when he used different shieldings, the readings would get a little stronger, or less strong, depending on the material he used. And then Yuri Galev also did the same thing. What he found was dielectric insulators and conductors, when used as shielding, affect the readings. Right. It affects how the velocity of ether that goes through those directed tubes. And that's super significant, because if you're measuring fluctuations of periodicity throughout the day that correspond to the position of the stars and the sun throughout the day and year, well, if you're introducing materials that impede that flow, then you're going to reduce the measurement, right? You're going to make them trend towards 0, as they, right? That was the whole thing that Miller found through his repeated experiments and controls, is that the different shieldings affect the readings. And how they do the modern interferometer stuff now is they'll do it in a vacuum, they'll do it in a concrete steel basement, way below sea level, and they'll use, like I said, different shieldings, and they're just ensuring that they're giving maximum impedance to the ether flow that gives that velocity addition to give those fluctuations throughout the day. But they're still there, right? Like you were saying, they still measure those, but because the amplitude goes down, they interpret that as, oh, we're more precisely, accurately measuring the constancy of, because they've already assumed that it's a constant and that the result should not give periodicity measurements. And when they introduce variables that reduce the periodicity, they take that as confirmation of the constancy, which is crazy, because it's the opposite.
Absolutely. Will you speak with Handsome Truth? Yeah, sure. Why not? Are the Tropic of Cancer and Capricorn the same size? Tropic of Cancer is 22,859 miles. Is this incorrect? I know the sun's observed to move faster in its path closer to the Tropic of Capricorn, which would make sense for the sun covering more distance if, in fact, the Tropic of Capricorn is larger, as it would have to be on a FE map, right? The main point is, according to Globe Earth model, the tropics are the same size, 22,859 miles, but they can't be the same size on the FE map, right? How is this rectified? Are the two tropics, in fact, not the same size? You are correct that on a flat Earth, it wouldn't be the same size, and that would mean the sun is moving faster. It would have a different tangential speed, but have the same angular speed. So yeah, it would be moving faster, which seems to be supported by lots of evidence, like historical documentation that twilight is significantly shorter when you're sailing out in the south, etc. So. Rise above. Could you explain James Clerk Maxwell's equations and how they may be wrong? I am genuinely curious and appreciate any feedback.
No, his equations are correct. And that in the if you pull up that one where it shows the what is it, 1 over the square of the magnetic permeability times the electric permittivity equals the speed of light. Like that's it. That's for an induction rate relative to the medium that it's in. That's super accurate. Maxwell's equations all good. They all work, right? But when you measure the speed of light, when you go to actually measure it, it's different relative to every latitude, and that's facilitated by the ether, right? The movement of the magnetic permeability and electric permittivity is what's causing that. It's like it's dragging it along essentially.
Nice. Coherence. Watching these experimental videos, do you think the use of synthetic materials skews the natural true physics versus using things like trees, leaves, dirt, etc. outside with natural sun? This is basically stemming off the idea, the talking point that's like, well, the first step of a scientific experiment is the dependent variable, which is a naturally occurring observable phenomena. You then propose a cause and effect relationship test, which is a hypothesis, and then you have a presumed cause being your independent variable that you're going to manipulate and verify or falsify the idea that it is in fact the cause of the effect. That's true natural scientific experiment, and of course, these, for example, are synthetic and man-made. For one, you can use synthetic man-made technologies in an actual scientific experiment. In fact, you basically have to. You're going to be hard pressed to ever find anything you don't use anything man-made. It is that there's a naturally occurring observable phenomena, and then you manipulate the IV with that like technology or whatever. But further, this is technically not an experiment, I would say. Some may disagree. It's a measurement. Interferometry is highly precise measurement. When it comes to if something's moving, how fast is it moving? Is something curving? What's the geometry? These are measurement questions. They're not technically natural science questions. But of course, the group of people that try to call like Michelson-Morley a parlor trick and say that we can't talk about it, shouldn't use it, it's actually just because they know it's a bit out of their depth, and they've spoken out against it historically, so they can't walk it back. When you can't even discuss flat Earth unless you're going to step outside of natural scientific experiment into measurements, because again, is the Earth a sphere, for example, is a measurement question. So you couldn't even invoke long distance observations or celestial navigation, which that group loves to do, ironically. That's a measurement. So there's my take on that.
I got another aspect of that is variables that you can manipulate, right? So for Michelson-Morley types interferometers, one of the things that they manipulated was they were spinning the interferometer relative to the time of day to see if the minimum and maximum peaks would be reached that would correspond to when the Earth is aligned with these different supposed directions of motion and things like that. And then also when you get into the shielding, how that will affect the amplitude, like all these variables, right? Just because it's a man-made device and things doesn't mean like what you're measuring isn't like you can't manipulate that and narrow down like the causal mechanism, right? Or some and build off of that. That's preposterous, right? We're looking at fringe patterns, right? These are natural occurring events. I mean, the first one that they did, the Fresnel drag, they used sunlight and moving water. If sunlight and moving water isn't a natural enough for you, then like you were saying, then nothing is. How are you going to say anything about anything? That's insane. So like this super rigid view of looking at it it just sets you up to not know anything about anything when you don't know anything and you could just hand wave dismiss it. but then use the same argument for another aspect. It's retarded.
It's very gatekeeperish. Sunlight hits moving streams all the time. The sun moving in the sky is a naturally occurring observable phenomena. When we see the interferometry, the most highly precise form of measurement that is known to man to this day and probably ever, has a direct correlation with where the sun is in its cycle and solar motion and time of year. I mean, I can't imagine someone that's a truther and realizes that we're being deceived about the Earth would somehow want to exclude that. Commercial sound and video. What you think of the third person going to Antarctica? I hadn't heard of any of the other contestants besides Crumb. It's good to see other platforms are out there. Apparently that was like allegedly a flat earther. I don't know if it was actually a flat earther or not, but someone that was playing a prank, and claiming that they were going to pay for a third ticket, but they're actually not. And there was a girl named Liz who's a flat earther who supposedly won. I talked to her in Discord briefly. I encouraged her to exercise caution as to the veracity of the claim that someone was going to pay for it. Apparently they weren't. I guess they started a GoFundMe to try to replace the ticket. So that's what I know. I encourage any additional flat earthers to go, though, of course.
What do they mean? Like, I was kind of loosely following that, but basically Duffy got an email from some random guy that said he was a flat earther and he was going to sponsor someone golden ticket style, and then he reneged on it. Do we even know who that person is? Like, is that an actual person? And further,
I haven't heard a name.
If you take someone's word from an email on something like that and you're making all these promises, right? Like, that's on you to do your due diligence and find out who that person is. Are they serious? Are you going to enter a contract? Especially for someone that's in the business of finance and has was it like pending charges and settlements on things like that. You should know about like the responsibility you have before you start making claims with people's money and stuff. So this idea that like we're now going to replace the ticket. Well, then there was no ticket to begin with. So like this whole thing is insane. And the way that he framed it in his video where he was like, the flat earth community, blah, blah, blah. No. We have a community of people and you didn't verify who this random email person was with any of the people in the community. And that dude, that the whole thing is just insane.
It makes me like suspect as to if it even was a flat earther. It's just this perfect narrative for them to virtue signal and have some dude pretending to be a flat earther. But this is even the funnier part. Go read the comments. They're all like, "Oh, they're virtue signaling. They're so upset that someone would email and deceive people and blah blah blah." Dude, literally, that's all their side does. Okay, Simon Dan has sent fake emails. He sent them to me. I just ignored them. Sent them to all these different flat earthers claiming to have inside information, in-depth lies and deception about like working at certain places with the nest and all this inside information. And then makes videos mocking and how stupid flat earthers are to fall for it. And then they all laugh and cheer it on. Haha, yeah, such stupid flat earthers. They're all sadists and find enjoyment out of humiliating them and stuff. They all have no problem with that. But Toon creates an entire fake document and then uploads a video in advance as proof that he had known it was fake the whole time, starts feeding it to different flat earthers to deceive them, developed an entire fake document, and started sending it out to people, fake lying about who he was and pretending that it was a valid source. And then they all laugh and brag about how stupid flat earthers are. Ha ha, we deceived them. Ha ha, we were able to lie and deceive the flat earthers. Netflix does the same thing. Hit piece, misrepresents everything, lies about everything. Jake Paul does the same thing, comes and acts like he's a flat earther just to put it in a hit piece and lie about the whole thing. And it's just this reoccurring theme. The guy that came to Flatoberfest did the same thing. Jimmy Kimmel sent a guy to do the same thing. And they don't have a problem with any of that. They brag about it. They love it. They like it. They donate to it. They support it. They have no moral contention with it at all. Then some anonymous random person allegedly claiming to be a flat earther that none of us know anything about supposedly offers to pay $35,000 for a ticket. He doesn't vet the claim, and then somehow flat earthers are all deceptive and fraudulent. It's such a joke. This is the main difference. All flat earthers will disavow that guy, no matter whether he's a globe or a flat earther. We would all say that's wrong, that's deceptive, that's ridiculous. You shouldn't have trusted him, but no one should do that. Like we will almost universally disavow it. Sure, you'll find some outliers that'll be like, I think it's funny. Well, Duffy does this and that, so it serves him right or whatever. But most of us will be like, no, dude, lying about something like that is wrong. We disavow it. Yet for years, 99% of the other side has refused to disavow the behavior on that side doing the exact same thing. In fact, their main figures do it, make streams about it, talk about it to this day, brag about it, take victory laps, and are all supported in doing so. So so the irony of that video is that really it just elucidates there's a huge contrast between the two groups. One is consistently trying to actually have virtue and integrity. The other side is just like laughably hypocritical and dishonest, and all their virtue is just completely fake. It's just completely fake. So that's my take on it. I think it's funny. I will say I watched part of it. He did at least point out that flat earthers have been lied to a lot, but he only brings up the mainstream people. It doesn't bring up that McToon does it. That McToon slandered me for 5 straight years. That McToon incessantly lies for a living. That McToon sent fake documents and fake emails constantly to seeking people. And that Simon Dead did the same thing, and they all support it. But he did say, like, I didn't think any flat earther would do that because they've been on the receiving end of it. And it's like, yeah, we don't do that. We don't know who that is. We would all disavow him.
Yeah, I haven't even heard a name. He didn't say who it was.
Dude, it was some Indian name. It's not even like a real person. It was like, Pajit Pai or something. Like, what?
Imagine if I did it. Imagine if I did that, like people would be so pissed at me. They'd be like, what are you doing? That's so bad. Such a bad look. That's so dishonest. But when their figures that make content do it, they literally applaud it. And that's why it's like, you go read the comments, like, I can't believe someone did that. That you gotta lie to flurf, gotta grift to flurf, gotta be fraudulence goes directly in with being a flurf. It's like, it's such a joke, right? Like, you people are such degenerates. So yeah, that's my take on that. All right, Cannon, I missed what you guys were saying about the double slit experiment. Was that a legitimate experiment? You want to take that one?
Yeah, so the IV in there is the position of the slit, like which one's blocked off and which one isn't, and none of it ever gives you a part of a interference pattern that corresponds to a particle. They only ever see the diffraction of a wave pattern. And then the same applies for the quantum eraser experiment. So the IV manipulation there is that they're changing the location of which way it's going to be blocked, and then they still get the diffraction pattern that corresponds to a wave. It's just that the reading is broken up between 2 different detectors. So when you look at it separately, you're like, oh my God, there's the particle, we found it. It retroact blah blah blah. But when you combine the 2 fringes, it's the same. It's always the diffraction pattern of a wave. It's never the particle pattern. When you watch videos about double slit experiments, you'll only see cartoon renditions of what it would look like for the particle. No one's ever been able to substantiate that. And the reason that they say that quantum computing doesn't work, or that it's hard to get it to work, rather, is that the qubit processor starts to the wave function collapses inside of it when there's ambient temperature. So they have to keep them cooled to like 0 Kelvin. Like, that's the big hurdle that they have to overcome, because any ambient temperature will cause quantum decoherence, right? It'll make the wave function collapse, and you'll only get that wave function. And when you do the double slit experiment, if you take a heat gun and shine it over, pointing at the wave or pointing at that light pattern, it never collapses into the particle pattern. Never been done. Got some videos on my channel of a guy breaking that down, and it's like the main causal reason as to why they say quantum computer doesn't work doesn't manifest in anything that you could do, right? It's all fake.
Absolutely.
False interpretation.
Dude, and that false interpretation is really the cornerstone of modern quantum mechanics. It's so funny. All right, cool. We got through the questions. So I'm going to play this Flatoberfest video. It is 5 minutes. We'll play that. And you guys want to think about any final things you want to say or what you got coming up this week, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, I'm going to head off real quick. I got to go take care of some stuff. But if I can give a quick shout out to the Czech lads, the Ether Cosmology has gone international and being headed by No Globe Dominic. Here's the channel that I linked in chat here. You guys can check him out. Support them. The Czech scene is growing fast with flat Earth and Ether and all that. Those guys are crushing it. Some people even call Dom the Czech Witsit, so it's a huge compliment. He crushes me. You can check after they air stuff for their debates and whatnot. It'll be CC'd, so if you just want to like read and follow along or whatever. I mean, the dude is an absolute monster when it comes to debating flat Earth and Ether and like all the things that we're all dealing with here in American land. He's over there crushing it. So they're starting an international variant check those guys out. And Tuesday, Shane's going to be doing a presentation on what was it? The stars and maps that are derived from that, the old celestial sphere. So he's going to be breaking that down in depth. Going to be, his magnum opus, as they say. So stay tuned for that. And then we'll do research and reading night on Thursdays, and then Flat Earth Fridays on Friday. Episode 112. If you haven't seen episode 111, definitely check it out. We just had Dr. Bennett on again, aka Cassander, and he broke down a debate review of debate that Kane and I had with relativists.
Nice, very cool. Yeah, I was salty that I missed the notification for that. Well, thank you, man, for popping in last minute. Always a gem to have you in, my brother. And yeah, go show love to Ether Cause and Space Audits on YouTube, and follow him on X as well. All right, brother. Thank you so much. We're gonna queue up the Flatoberfest video. Not too late to get your tickets. And I've just recently, got my place I was staying, and there's plenty of places there and stuff like that. So you guys can still get your tickets. FlatEarthFestival.com.
And you can camp there at the place as well.
Correct. Yep.
It's an outdoor festival. Yeah, this is going to be cool. Got all my toys out. I've been playing all week.
Yeah, it's going to be cool, man. Cool. So let's play this video real quick, and then we'll wrap it up. Oh, sorry, I was muted. All right, nice, very cool, man. I'm looking forward to it. It's always very cool, man. You get a bunch of truthers all in one place. Yeah, it's just something about it. It's very cool. Zach, you want to kind of tell people what you'll be doing?
Yeah, we're going to be doing How the World Works, Cami and I. We have our own little place set up, and it gives you the opportunity to see some hands-on, I'm going to hand you a gyroscope, and you get to actually feel the force that's fighting against you trying to turn it. That's my favorite part. We'll have the Van de Graaff generator there, the Wimhurst generator, with a couple different demonstrations. We're going to do the two plates with material in the middle, so you can crank it yourself and watch the defy gravity pretty much. And then I want to do one with ionic wind, so people can actually feel the wind that's created from electrostatic potential difference in the air itself. That alone can create wind. So and then we have the couple new additions, the Rubens tube, where you have the fire that shows the frequency pattern of noise and sound. And then we also have a Chladni plate. It's the plate that vibrates and makes different patterns when you change the frequency. And then, of course, the Tesla coil with the gases and all that kind of stuff, lighten that up, like the old Dan Dimension videos. And then Cami has all kinds of stuff with magnetic filter papers and magnets and Polaroid filters and different types of minerals and how they do these things naturally. How a lot of this stuff that, most of technology is just mimicking something that already happens in nature. It's really amazing. And she gets into a lot of that kind of stuff. So it's more hands-on. You get to come over and play with the stuff. If you'd like to see your voice in fire, you can come on out and we can do that too. But yeah, it's always been a hit. Everybody seems to really enjoy it. And I really enjoy doing it.
Nice, very cool. All right, cool. Yeah, so I will be speaking there, and we got some other cool speakers, some cool music. Should be cool. And am I mistaken? Is this maybe the last one ever?
Yes. This will
Yeah.
be the last Flatoberfest.
Last Flatoberfest ever. So I definitely encourage you to consider going out there. And like we said, you can camp there, etc. So, all right, cool. FlyersFestivals.com. You can use witsitgetsit. Zach, do you have a code?
I don't think though we use Bob Win or thanks Bob.
Okay, so you can use thanks Bob, I think all caps, or witsitgetsit. I'm sure other people have their code as well. All right, cool. Anything else you want to say about what you got coming up?
Probably not. Well, I know there's not going to be a GLOBEBUSTERS Tech. We're going to have people coming in town. We've had Liz here for a week from Scotland, Liz the Iron Maiden. It's been so wonderful. Yeah, and it's funny because when you come to these things and you meet people for the first time, a lot of people are like, are these people real? Are they CIA or FBI agents? Or there's all kinds of stuff in the conspiracy theory community. So yeah, it's funny when you hear them say, "You guys are just real people." I've heard it so many times over the years, and yeah, we're just all just normal people that want the truth to get out there. And we know that that is important, and that's why we do this. So yeah,
Nice.
we're probably going to be going live from Flatoberfest. Somebody will be, and I'll drop it in chat, or I'll drop a link so you guys can come watch and maybe see our demonstrations up there.
Cool. All right. I think I may do an interview. I think I might be on Brother Nathaniel's doing an interview this week. I am going to try to stream maybe 3 times, at least 2 times this week. Then I leave out Thursday nights. And I will be at Flatoberfest, and I don't know, maybe I'll try and do a stream or something while I'm there. I usually get pretty distracted and occupied, but cool. That's what we have coming up. Yeah. All right. Cool. I think I checked. I didn't see any donations or anything that we missed, so I think we are good. Let me just double check. Yes, we are good. All right. Cool. And if anyone supports after the stream ends, we'll make sure you read you out the next time. Cool. So thank you guys for kicking it, and be kind to each other. Don't lie to each other. Open up your mind because there's truth inside. All right. Peace out, everyone.
Peace.